I think we're just. Okay, sorry about that. We're starting to record now. So everybody who watches the recording will miss all the amazing things I just said. So sorry. Anyway, we hold a number of very large events. We had one just a few weeks ago that a number of you I know attended. It was our annual dinner. We had about 850 people there. We honor someone every year. We honored former Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. It was a fabulous event. Our largest event each year is in the spring/early summer. It's going to be on June 5th. This year, it's our annual conference, and we had about 1,500 at our conference last year. It's a great event. Mark your calendar. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn, to participate, to network. So that's a little bit about us. And very importantly, you may have noticed I said that we are the US chapter of the Society for International Development. The Society for International Development, or SID, of which we are a chapter, was founded in 1957. And there are a number of chapters, a few around the world. They ebb and flow. We are the largest and most active of those chapters, largely due to our location in DC and the ability to draw on the community here and have a membership model. But SID itself operates like a think tank and does really interesting work, working a lot with the UN, and is a super organization. And amazingly, my great friend Larry Cooley is the chair of the governing council of SID. So we interact a fair amount in that regard. So on that note, I would like to introduce Larry, who in addition to that role also serves on the board as the chair of the board of World Learning. And I think many of you know him best as the founder and president emeritus of Management Systems International, or MSI, which is now part of Tetra Tech. Larry has served as project director or principal investigator for numerous high visibility domestic and international public management initiatives, as a facilitator for 3 cabinet level working groups in the United States, and as an advisor to the leaders of more than a dozen governments and international agencies. He is the author or co-author of widely used methodologies for managing policy change, scaling innovation, entrepreneurship development, and results-based management. He also worked for UNDP, the World Bank, Practical Concepts Incorporated, and as a Peace Corps volunteer, and is an elected fellow and board member of the National Academy of Public Administration, a non-resident senior fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution, and a trustee or advisory board member for a wide range of foundations, nonprofit organizations, and global initiatives. Most relevant to today's event, Larry is the co-founder of the Scaling Up Community of Practice, a global community of practice on scaling up development outcomes, along with Johannes Lynn, who is here today as well. And I will let Larry tell you more about both that community of practice and today's event. So thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks.
You get introductions like that when you're old. Let me just say a couple of words by way of introduction. First of all, a big thank you to Catherine and the SID staff for having us here. It's no small task to host an event like that. We really appreciate it. I want to say a word by way of introduction to the session, and it's mostly about the community of practice that Johannes and I had the good luck and good fortune to start 10 years ago with the help of our third amigo, David DiFerrante, who's here with us also today. And that, I have to say, has grown beyond my wildest expectation. During those years, scaling up has definitely scaled up. I mean, we're not where we need to be, but we're certainly not where we were. And what started out with, I think, 40 members, not even members, 40 people that we crowded into a room to talk about this 10 years ago, we are now 4,200 from people from 70 countries and about 400 organizations, united by nothing other than a desire to do a better job of taking interventions in both the development and the climate space to scale. So this is I can honestly say, a labor of love. It's been mostly a volunteer effort for all of these years and continues to be such. Within that community of practice, one of the things we've done, I could say maybe the most ambitious thing, we've done so far is a piece of work that we're midway through right now, which looks at what scaling up requires from funder organizations. Now, we're under no illusion that funder organizations are the most important player in this, but neither are we under any illusion that they don't make a difference. And for better or for worse, a lot of what happens or doesn't happen seems to be shaped by what funders do and don't do. So we decided to look first at funders. And Johannes and another colleague, Richard Cole, who's not here today, have been leading that effort. I've been kind of along for the ride, but now trying to step up and do my part on it. So a big piece of that has been looking at those institutions kind of from the inside out, not the outside in, working with the staffs of those organizations to look at themselves, which I think is quite a courageous thing for them to have done. And based on the first 13 such organizations, we've written an interim report. That's what we're going to be sharing with you today. Personally, I think it's very powerful about the role that organizations can and in some cases are playing. So we've got a panel, we've got a presentation by Johannes, who's going to actually share those interim results with you. But we want to start with some framing remarks from Zingai Mutu. I had it a minute ago. Zingai, give me your last name. Say it for me.
Mutumbuka.
Mutumbuka.
Why don't you ask?
I had it and it slipped right away. Zingai Mutumbuka. And the reason we wanted Zingai to do this is he's played all three roles that we're going to be talking about today. He's been a minister of government, the first minister of education in Zimbabwe. He spent a long and successful career at the World Bank. And then subsequently, he's been on the boards of and helping a number of nonprofit and implementing organizations that have had to work with those very same funders and with those very same governments to try and get things done. So we thought there was nobody better than Zingai to sort of kick us off here and give us a sense of what this looks like from the outside in. After that, I'm going to transition to Johannes and I'll say a word more about him when I do that. And then we're going to have a panel discussion and open it up for questions. While this all happens, those of you who are online are encouraged to use the chat function. When I'm talking, Johannes is going to be covering this, and anytime he's not talking, he's going to be covering this. And we're going to try to respond to the questions that come online, either by answering them online, since Johannes is going to be right there doing that. Or if it's a question that's easily shared with the room, Johannes will voice it on behalf of whoever puts it into the chat box. So beginning now, feel comfortable using the chat for anything you want, a comment, a question. We'll either try to respond online or we'll try to respond here in the room to whatever your issues may be. With that, let me introduce Zingai. Zingai, please come with us, come up here and share whatever you'd like to share with us by way of kicking this off. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me. I think this is a very interesting organization. I didn't know that it existed. As you heard from Larry, I worked at the World Bank and also worked in government. If I've done anything terrible at the World Bank, you have to blame David Deferrand here because he's the one who recruited me. And if I did anything terrible in government, you have to go and dig out Robert Mugabe, who is the one who appointed me to be Minister of Education. By the way, he was a good Mugabe when he did that. But subsequently, of course, we know that he turned into a dictator. I think this topic you are discussing is very interesting from where I stand. Interesting because thanks to COVID, we are in serious trouble regarding the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I have often said in Africa that before COVID, perhaps 1 or 2 African countries were going to achieve the SDG for education. post-COVID, I'm willing to bet my last dollar that no single African country is going to achieve SDG goal, SDG 4 goal. The challenge we face really is not that we don't have the knowledge, but how do we scale up? How do we work at scale? And I think that what we are going to discuss here is very, very important. For me, scaling up means working in government. But for me also, scaling up means working in agencies such as you guys are working in or working with. But there's a tension there. I have often said, copying from my boss and my brother and my colleague David, that I've worked between two big cats because the government is a big cat, the World Bank is a big cat, and I'm sort of at the interface of these two cats, which probably need to work together in order to make progress. I also have had the fortune of working on a program called the Harvard University Ministerial Leadership Program, where I think almost all of you know, I certainly know, because I've been through the process, that no government trains ministers of government. You are just appointed one day. You are not even given the terms of reference. You are just told you are minister. And everybody is coming to your office thinking that you are a miracle worker and you are going to solve all their problems. So the Harvard Ministerial Leadership Program is really the first one of its kind, where we are trying to help ministers become transformative leaders. And I think transformation is one word that he underscores in some of the work he has done, and I think he's going to report on. So for me, I think we have reached an inflection point in terms of development work. And we either can continue business as usual, or we can really make the right turn and probably enable some of the goals to be achieved. So I guess from that perspective, we are at a very, very interesting point. However, I think that there's a problem. And what's the problem here? The problem, as I see it, is that many donors do not want to change the way they work. They are still living in what I call project mode, which Johannes described as transactional. We go from project to project, we do transactions. Whereas what we need is really to change from transactions to programs. You cannot sustain transactional activities, but you certainly can sustain transformation because you are changing the whole system. So I think that this is the challenge that we face. We know that big organizations like the bank is sometimes considered like a well. You know, for a well or an articulated track, for it to turn is very, very difficult. And I think we are challenged here to find ways of how these huge bureaucracies can turn around. But the problem does not only reside with bureaucracy, or with the agencies, it also resides in government. Government needs to change the way it does business. What does this involve? For me, really what it involves is finding ways where we can meet each other and focus on getting the biggest bang for the buck, if I might use an American expression. We already see some development along these lines. I've been on the the Board of Results for Development. Thanks again due to my fellow traveler in seeing David Defeland, who started this organization. And R4D, or Results for Development, really has started some leading work on how we can change projects to programs, transactions, transformation. The way they work with governments today is that they do what they call co-create. In other words, you don't have an agent coming there with a project, or you don't have a government coming there with a project and then saying, finance this project. What they do is, in fact, to work together. That is staff from R4D, staff from the government, and other interested parties. They may be NGOs, there may be other entities within the country. And I think this is a model that probably can produce better results than the project mode in which we have been. And I guess for me, what I really would like to see is more of this. I would like to see a situation where we can move into a situation where agencies will come in with their money, and the governments who often come in with local knowledge and context can collaborate together, and particularly focus on going to scale. Because unless we are going to go to scale, it is not possible for us to achieve our goals. I emphasize that, and I'm not saying this because I was in government. I emphasize that unless agencies can work with government, you are not going to be able to make an impact. Because government as the people, government as the programs. But this does not mean international or local NGOs don't have a role. They have a very important role. But the accent today must be on collaboration so that we can go to scale. I always talk about, let's do big things. Let's not focus on small things. Big things will get us there. Big things will give us a chance for a stab at the sustainable development goal. Thank you.
You. I'm going to transition to my friend Comrade Johannes in just a moment, but I want to just seize on one point that Zingai made in talking about the roles and responsibilities. We've deliberately composed this study to look at the role of implementers, at the role of funders, and at the role of what we call intermediaries. And in some of the organizations we're going to be highlighting today, we're going to try to look at the interface between those three types of organizations. Johannes is going to share with you now the results from the first 13 case studies. We're now involved in 12 more. This year, we're trying to focus particular attention on funders in the health sector and also funders who are private foundations, whatever sector they happen to be in. Because we're convinced that there's a role to be played by private funds and private funders that's been underexplored in the past. First year's work focused primarily on official funders, with a couple of important exceptions that we're highlighting today. The second year's work that we're involved in right now, much less so. We're trying to focus to the extent possible on private foundations this year to round out this picture. Johannes, as you've already heard, spent a long career at the World Bank. He spent subsequently a substantial period of time at the Brookings Institution, setting up an entity called the Wolfenson Center that worked explicitly on scaling. It was through that he and I met each other as two lonely souls working on this problem a long time ago. It's not lonely at all anymore. In fact, now it runs some risk of many voices in many places. And I think one of the functions we're trying to play is bring some of those voices together. With that, I'll transition to Johannes. Take it away, Johannes.
Great. Thank you, Larry. I hope everybody in this room can hear me, as well as everybody online who is has joined us today, and I welcome everybody very much. I thank our colleagues from SID for hosting us, and all of you who are in this room who braved the cold in Washington, unusual cold. Thanks for coming in this morning. And I welcome everybody out there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So my job is to summarize in about 20 minutes a rather dense set of slides, for which I apologize, the density of which I apologize. You will have a much more lively, I think, discussion following the presentation, and I'm very happy and thankful for our colleagues from CRS and from CARE who've joined us today, and of course Charlotte, who also joined for actually contributing insights from the front line, so to speak, rather than the somewhat high-level contributions that I will summarize here from our work over the last year and a half on the mainstreaming, scaling, and funder organizations initiative that we've undertaken in the scaling community of practice. So what we are basically reporting on is an interim stock taking that we carried out with a couple of reports that we published in June and posted on our website. And if you're interested in reading those reports, you'll find them on our website, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. So let me start with some basic information on the mainstreaming initiative. I seem to have an issue here with my slides. What happened? Am I still up there? No.
There's a misconnection.
There's a misconnection. I don't know whether anybody can hear me out there.
Give us 1 second. We're having a Wi-Fi issue. God. Sorry about that.
Okay, you're back.
There you go.
You're back. Okay, great.
Awesome.
So I hope you're all still out there. We had a Wi-Fi issue, and I will start with my presentation with the basic information on the mainstreaming initiative. So first of all, why do we have this initiative? We already heard a little bit from Larry about it, but let me briefly summarize. First of all, why do we care about scaling? Well, as we heard from Singai, if we want to address global needs and global targets, we need to stop working on one-off projects, one by one at a time. We need to stop working with pilots to nowhere and instead work with a scope and ambition enough to address the problems that we're facing with the SDGs, obviously the clearest lodestar to follow and to aim for. Why do we focus on funders? Again, Larry already mentioned, funders are not the frontline actors, implementers. However, they do influence in an important way very often what the implementers do. And so we need to make sure that funders actually are focused on scaling in the way they support implementers and not hinder them as they do all too often. Finally, why do we focus on mainstreaming in funder organizations, of scaling in funder organizations? It's because we believe that scaling has to be pursued systematically. It has to be sustainably integrated into the way the funder organizations operate, into their institutional strategy, their operational practices, and they really have to be geared in all they're doing to support the implementers in pursuing and hopefully over time achieving sustainable impact at scale. Now, I seem to have problems with advancing my screen. Can you maybe help me? Excuse me, I think you only got broken. Okay, there we go. So what do we mean by mainstreaming? Well, mainstreaming really is, simply said, it's integrating the scaling perspective throughout what funders do. It doesn't happen on its own. You really have to develop an integrated, systematic and long-term change process in the institutions that you are engaging with. And you see on the right-hand side some key aspects of what you would be covering if you want to mainstream scaling. Start with leadership, with a clear mission, vision, and strategy to pursue and support implementation at scale. You have to have measurable scale targets. Scaling has to be integrated into your theory of change, your logic models, and your monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes. You have to have framework, tools, and guidance for scaling, so your staff actually know how to go about it. It has to be integrated into project innovation, grant design, and review processes. Very often, especially in larger organizations, you probably need a dedicated unit and human and financial resources to actually support your scaling processes. And finally, you need to, very importantly, integrate the scaling mentality into the organizational culture of the organization that you're working with. So what have we done today? We have organized our work on mainstreaming in 2 phases. So far, we have completed in partnership with 13 funded organizations, 13 case studies. They're all can be found on our website. This has involved multilateral and bilateral official agencies, foundations, and INGOs, and we hear today from CRS and CARE, and it involved innovation and research funders. We have produced these 2 reports that you see on the left-hand side of the slide, an interim systems report, synthesis report, and a policy brief which summarizes the main findings.
The slide isn't advancing.
There
you go.
We got it.
We got it. Who's advanced? I didn't advance it. Let's see. Okay, well, it worked one way or another. So we have prepared these 2 reports, the synthesis report, which has quite a lot of detail, and the policy brief, which is a summary. We also did some work, cross-cutting focus on education, a paper by Larry and a colleague. And finally, we've been working with OECD DAC Secretariat and MOPAN, the multilateral organizations review organization that monitors what multilateral organizations are doing, in actually putting together some OECD DAC guidance notes for bilateral and multilateral organizations and how to pursue scaling. I believe a very important initiative. This guidance note should be published by the end of this month on the OECD DAC website. Now, with that as background, our first phase, we now are into our second phase where we do more funder studies, case studies. We will have a special focus on foundations. We do a deep dive on agriculture and health sectors. We will work on and are working on making sure we have the recipient perspective, and Charlotte will report on that later this morning. We are developing mainstreaming tracking tools so that funder organizations can actually track to what extent they're able to mainstream. And finally, we're engaging in outreach and advocacy activities, which are important because if we just sit on our results and not share them widely, as we are trying to do today, then of course, there's not really going to be the impact that we are looking for. So this is the work program that we have in mind. Very briefly here, a slide. Thank you for sharing. We have here the list of funders whom we've been working with, the completed ones on the left. You see that we focus quite heavily on multilateral and bilateral official organizations in the first round, but we also had CARE and CRS among the INGOs. And our current ongoing work, we have much more focus, as Larry mentioned already, on foundations, but we're also pursuing some more multilateral and bilateral organizations, and we have our cross-cutting focus on agriculture and health. Now, with that as background introduction, let me move to what really is the main part of my presentation. What are the results so far, interim results? And based on our synthesis report, I'll first of all say a few words about general findings on the state of mainstreaming and the role of funders in supporting scaling, and I'll then turn to some findings and lessons on what are the drivers and the enablers of mainstreaming that we have identified as we've worked with the 13 funder organizations so far. Next slide. So first of all, let's move on and look at the general findings. In terms of the interest that we found among funders, it's really important to notice that, as to some extent already been mentioned, that there's been a growing interest by funders in the scaling agenda. And it is reflected in the fact that we actually have been engaged in more funding, more case studies than I think we expected when we started this process. But it's also, as you listen to funder presidents such as Ajay Banga from the World Bank or the president of IDB and African Development Bank and others, they all talk about scale now. So this is an important, I think, development over the last 10 years or so. And it's probably driven by the fact that we realize that there is this urgency that Singa already mentioned about meeting the SDGs, but also realizing that the money we have to actually support the achievement of the SDGs is really not sufficient unless we focus much more effectively on pursuing and achieving impact at scale. So there is greater interest, but we also find that for most funders that we're working with, it's very much work in progress. Many of them are still at the beginning of the process, and if you look to the right of the screen, you see 6 sort of balls here. The left is where many funders still are today, that in fact, the whole scaling agenda is still outside their organization. Some funders, and indeed maybe the majority of funders that we've worked with, scaling is already entering as a concept and as an objective into the organization, but remains on the periphery. In some funders, it's somewhere that you have a group of people in the organization that are pushing it. In a few organizations, we've seen that it's moved towards the center, with particular leadership focused on scaling, and in very few, it's actually become intrinsic to the organization. Now, today we'll hear from CRS and CARE, who are fairly far to the right. You can confirm whether I'm right on this, but that's sort of our perspective on what you are, sort of on the right-hand side of this graph. The ultimate goal, I think, has to be for organizations to have at least scaling at the center, or preferably actually have scaling intrinsically across the organization as far as possible. So this is where we are today. We have many more organizations, fund organizations, focusing or trying to focus on scaling, but still many of them not very far along the process of mainstreaming. Then let's look at what we actually mean by scaling, because when funders focus on scaling, it's important, we already heard about this, that they not only focus on transactional scale, as many of them still do. In my own alma mater, I think the World Bank remains among them. We're in the World Bank, we've always been very proud that we operate at a large scale. But as I look back, and even as I look at some of the work of an organization like the World Bank today, I think we still remain very much in the transactional mode of scaling, which means we define scaling simply as more money, more projects, larger projects, more people reached, more places covered. And partnerships that we engage in are mostly used to try and get out more money into a particular project or program that we're supporting. We're still focused too often on impact of one-off projects on what they achieve at completion, not actually what they put in place so that others can build on what we put in place. They focus on outputs rather than outcomes. They don't tend to address systemic barriers to sustainable impact at scale with a longer-term vision of what's needed. And they consider outcomes in terms of absolute numbers against baseline. So, we've added X number of people. We have, in the climate space, we've reduced X percent or X tons of CO emissions. But we're not generally looking against whether or not we're making sufficient progress against targets, especially if actually our targets, the scale of our targets expands because the problem expands over time. So really, in this transactional mode, yes, we're focusing on scale, but we're not focusing on transformational scaling, which is where I think we need to go, where we focus on the long-term scaling need and the size of the problem and potential pathways to actually reach it, where we design and implement and evaluate programs as stepping stones to sustainable scale, where we address the systemic barriers and we align the interventions with the enabling conditions that allow scaling and sustainability, and where we consider outcomes in relation to the targets, not in relationship, and the moving targets very often, unfortunately, and not in relationship to baseline. So this is where, and by the way, this is an insight that we've, for our own benefit, have sort of found from our work. Previously, we were not really focused on this distinction in transactional scale and transformational scaling. So that for us was an insight, which, by the way, I think I can credit to some of the work in our case studies, because you're the ones who actually brought this to our attention. So I thank you very much. Now, next, we need to have funders, and this is a point that Tingai and Larry already made. We need to have funders working together along the scaling pathway. And you see here on this slide sort of the typical stylized pathway of scaling from the earliest ideas to operating at sustainable scale through research and development, proof of concept, transition to scale, and actually scaling. And the good news is, as you look and we look at where funders are operating, you actually see them operating all along, different funders, all along the scaling pathway. Research funders on the left, medium-sized official funders more to the right, challenge funders and vertical funds somewhere in the middle, foundations also to the left and middle, large-scale multilateral and bilateral funders like the World Bank, the regional development banks, the big bilaterals, could and should work, of course, on the scaling side towards the right-hand side, and the large INGOs also. So in a way, we have the ingredients in place for successful scaling. The problem, however, is that actually there are gaps along the way, and gaps actually are the more typical picture as you look at what happens on the ground, namely that funders do not hand off naturally from one to the other along the pathway, or hand off ultimately, of course, when you reach sustainable scale to the government or the private sector as needed. But they're operating too much in isolation. I think the point that we heard earlier from Sina is absolutely critical. And we'll come back to that when we talk about partnerships. So the next issue that we face is the project, and again, the thing I mentioned is the project mode in which practically all funders operate. Now, some people say, let's get rid of the project mode. I have to tell you from my experience, that's not likely to be possible and actually not likely desirable. What we need to do is we need to change the way we look at projects and we do projects. And what I've, in this rather silly little graph here on the slide, what you see is starting with one project, to call it a pilot or just the project you have been working on, our tendency is to, yes, we want to make sure we complete this project and get the results we promised to whoever in the process. But that's actually not good enough of focus. During the design, during the implementation, we really have to focus on what happens at the end of the project. So when we reach the end of the project, we have put in place the necessary conditions that allow subsequent stage, a subsequent project, or a subsequent program, if you wish, to continue what we started. So we need to think about the project as building the platform on which to allow the next step along this pathway towards an ultimate scale goal to be pursued, not necessarily by the same funder organization, but by systematically handing off to other funders. Go back to that earlier slide with the pathway that are ready to, in principle, ready to take over. But of course, that means you have to actually prepare the next step as you already complete the previous steps. So this is demonstrated graphically in this graph. An additional aspect that funders need to remember is that they need to function not just as financiers, but as intermediaries, and intermediaries that support scaling with more than just money. And in this wheel, you see system strengthening, fundraising, and so on. Whatever institutional and platform building the funders can and should be doing in order to support the scaling process. One aspect to remember, though, is if you see your funding organization as an intermediary in this way, ultimately, remember, you're going to step away. You will stepping away. So have you built, in the meantime, local intermediaries who actually can take over from you, because intermediaries, in our experience, are always going to be important in scaling. So as you develop your own programs and projects as a funder, make sure you also support and develop intermediaries in the country in which you're working that can take over from you at the end of the process. And finally, and here we go back to the really what is the core here of, I think, of our scaling mainstreaming agenda. You have to focus on partnerships with local actors, partnerships with other funders, in order to allow you to continue this process along the scaling pathway in an uninterrupted and synergetic way. Now, the important thing we've learned, however, is that partnerships aren't costless. Partnerships takes time, take resources to create, to maintain, and therefore you really have to invest in partnerships. And what happens all too often is staff is told work in partnerships, but then they're not given the resources or the training or the capacity to actually deliver on the partnership agenda. So doing partnerships is something where you have to prioritize the right partners, and you have to invest resources and actually make and time and capacity to actually make partnerships happen. So Larry, I apologize. I think I'm going a little bit over time, if I may. Is that okay?
Time's well spent. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, so far we've talked about some general lessons about sort of what we've learned from the mainstreaming focus that we need to have as funders, or that funders need to have, I should say. I'm no longer in the funding business. Thank God, I can say almost. So let's move on now. What have we learned specifically about what are the drivers and the enablers of a mainstreaming process? We now focus on, if you wish, the inner workings of funder organizations. And what we've come up with is basically 8 drivers that must be in place for successful mainstreaming. And it's important to remember that these are not one-off fixes, but they require action across all 8. And given the complexity of the list that we have in front of us, probably with extended period of time and indeed learning as you go along and adjustment as you go along. So it's really a systematic long-term organizational change effort that is required here. I will very quickly run through each of these 8 drivers that we've identified to highlight sort of what they involve and where we currently are in terms of what funders have actually done so far. So the first driver, if you wish, and maybe it's the most obvious one, is leadership. You need sustained leadership of top management in the organization, the funder organization, to actually drive the scaling, the mainstreaming agenda. But it's important to also realize that leadership announcement and leadership pronouncements are not enough. You actually have to make sure that leadership drives the agenda into the mid-level staff and into management, into staff, because without their buy-in, without their engagement, and without their follow-through, not much is going to happen. So leadership clearly is important. Without leadership, taking leadership on the agenda, we will not find sort of the intrinsic and universal dissemination of the mainstreaming idea in the organization, but it's likely to remain unsuccessful or located in a particular location within the organization. So leadership, well, you announce that you're interested in scaling, but then of course you have to integrate this into your, and forcefully articulate into your vision of impact at scale and into the funder's role of achieving it. So mission statements, vision statements, goal statements have to have scaling explicitly listed. And actually we find that in many organizations that is now the case. But at the same time, and less often do we find that it's important to also then have impact metrics that actually reflect explicitly the scale dimension in a transformative way, not just in a transactional way. And it's worth reviewing in each case of a funder organization whether actually metrics that are associated with mission and vision and goals reflect the scaling dimension. The third area, that driver that we have identified, is that you need to have operational instruments, policies, and practices for scaling. That, in essence, is kind of the organizational plumbing that goes with funders' organizational activities, which means policies on programming, funding instruments and limits, procedures, guidelines, and criteria for project selection, supervision, and monitoring, even procurement and partnership policies. And finally, HR, human resource policies, all have to integrate the dimension of scaling and whether or not the organization is actually pursuing scaling through its policies and instruments. In practice, we find most funders are still quite a long way from having done so systematically, although some are further along than others. You need organizational, technical, and budget resources for scaling, because if staff feel, as they often feel, it's actually perhaps the most pervasive finding that we've run across in talking to staff. Staff feel overwhelmed by unfunded mandates that they're supposed to deliver on. And so what they're doing, they're kind of trying to manage, given very limited resources and capacity they have. Operations staff are trying to manage to meet all these unfunded mandates, but very often it means they're doing so more pro forma than really, in fact. And so if you now add the mainstreaming agenda, the mainstreaming objective to everything else they're already supposed to deliver on, without giving them additional resources, training, and capacity to actually deliver on it, chances are not much will happen. So it's very important that you actually give staff at the implementing on the ground the organization, technical, and budget resources. A fifth factor is localization. So we've heard about that earlier already. Transformational scaling is not going to happen if you don't involve local partners. It's government, but it's also CSOs, it's private sector, and they have to own the pathway that you are supporting as a funder. So you have to have this localization process, which means shifting power, shifting the decision-making authority out of the exclusive domain of the funder organization into the co-creation that Zinga mentioned, co-creation process, ideally. Now, funders have, of course, noticed that they have to have local presence. They have, many funders have started decentralizing staff. But let's be clear, decentralization on its own is not enough. Localization means much more than just decentralization of your staff into particular offices, regions, or in country. You really have to shift this process into the co-creation process that we heard before. The sixth driver is that's everybody, staff, but also your counterparts in country have to have the analytical tools, the learning, and the knowledge for scaling. So some funder organizations have started developing tools, developing the knowledge bases, but again, we find more needs to be done, and actually the community practice is, scaling community practice is hopeful that we can help in this regard by actually sharing the information across organizations that we have assembled. The penultimate factor is monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation is a critical factor in driving effective mainstreaming, because if you don't monitor and evaluate what you're doing on the ground with your funding and what you're doing with your mainstreaming process, you don't actually know whether you're succeeding in reaching the objectives, scale objectives, but also the mainstream objectives that you set for yourself. So you have to make sure that scaling is an explicit part of your monitoring evaluation approaches, which, by the way, they're generally not, as we have found. We systematically reviewed a number of monitoring evaluation policies of official agencies. We found that very few of them explicitly look at scaling. In addition, though, you also, if you are engaging in a mainstreaming exercise, you have to make sure that you actually monitor and evaluate whether your mainstreaming exercise is succeeding. And finally, yes, since this is a complex change in organizational change management process, mainstreaming, you need to plan and sequence the 8 interlocking processes that we've talked about, and be very systematic in the way you do it. And you have to focus, and this is really, I think, a takeaway for me personally, you have to focus on the incentives that the key actors within your institutions have in cooperating, in engaging on the mainstreaming process, because many of them, you'll find out, actually don't have the incentives or the capacity or both to actually deliver on the mainstreaming agenda. So I'm finally coming to close, and apologies for going a little longer than intended. Let me summarize that we have three overarching messages that we do think define the mainstreaming challenge and opportunity. First of all, mainstreaming is a complex change management process. It requires long-term commitment by the institution, by the leadership, and ultimately by the staff and mid-level management to shift from a transactional approach, which is the most common still, to a transformational steering approach. Secondly, you need consistent, sustained leadership in supporting the integration of mission into missions, in strategy, into operational processes, policies, and incentives for everybody in the institution. And you need to dedicate the necessary resources to actually make it happen. And finally, you need to effectively plan, prioritize, sequence, and monitor and evaluate, and when necessary, do mid-course corrections over a period that probably is more than just a year or two, probably is, and we've seen examples of this, and we'll hear probably some of that later today from our panelists, that can take 5 or even more years for successfully reaching the fully mainstream outcome that I think we all need. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Vic, is the camera going to switch over to me now?
Yes, you also.
Okay, so we've got a great panel to discuss this, and I want to tell you why we chose the panels that we did, and then I'm going to turn directly to them. So you heard earlier from Johannes that we had a range of cases that we looked at. Official funders, multilateral and bilateral, some foundations, but right in the middle of it was INGOs. And the reason INGOs were interesting to us is they really wear all three hats, not always at the same time. They're funders, they're fund recipients, and they're also intermediaries. And perhaps not surprisingly now, among the leading organizations in mainstreaming scaling were the couple of INGOs we looked at, CARE and CRS. Why? I think partially because there was some genuine leadership on this, but partially I think because they knew what it felt like to be on the other side of the transaction. They'd been on both sides of this thing. So beginning to think about when they're in the funder role, what does that mean, and how do we treat people the way we would like to be treated on this, I think was a little bit more natural for them than for perhaps some of the more official funders that are used to thinking in a rather different way. So we're looking at these two cases now because we think they're instructive, but also because we think they hold out promise for what others can do. That said, I'm hoping our panelists will not be self-congratulatory about this, because they have said, and we believe, that these organizations still have a long way to go in delivering against their promises. So we're going to ask people to reflect on the road traveled, but also the road yet to be traveled. We've got two perfect panelists for this, in part because the organizations have done a piece of what Johannes spoke about. They've actually created internal capacity and units that are looking after this scale issue. And I'm going to ask them to reflect on what it feels like to be in that position, trying to help an organization change. So we've got Matt Will from CRS, who's part of that function within CRS. And we've got Anita Keller from CARE, who plays a very similar role within CARE. Subsequently, I'm going to turn to Charlotte Coogan, because she's, as part of our effort, is looking specifically at recipients. In this case, I don't mean INGOs. I mean the people at the kind of end of the line who are in-country institutions trying to implement things, because we want to try to understand how this might look similarly or differently if you're looking at it from that perspective. So let me first talk with Matt and with Anita. And I want to, maybe I'll start with you, Anita, and ask you to reflect just a little bit on how your organization thinks about scale now. And if you can also work into that, say a word or two about what had to change internally to get to where you are right now?
Sure. I think that at CARE, where we started was that there were many different notions of what constituted scale. And I think that one of the most challenging and probably most important things to do is to get the whole organization to coalesce around a shared understanding of what scale is.
Yeah.
Right? And where we started was that a lot of folks at scale, a lot of folks at CARE thought of replication as being scale, and all replication aligns with the transactional scaling that you were talking about, where something worked in one place, we take it to another place and implement it, but through CARE's footprint and using grant funding. And there's two problems with thinking that way. First of all, the scale you can achieve will always be constrained by the footprint of the organization and by grant funding, which is so variable. And the second is that the most, and Johannes has alluded to this, the most that you can achieve through replication is sort of linear scale, right? Like a one-to-one graph. And yet we're already only solving 1% of the problem that the communities we serve face. And those problems are growing, as you mentioned. And so if we have any chance of achieving solutions that are at the scale of the problem, we have to be looking at getting exponential impact. Right?
Okay, so there's no question but that you're right about that. The question is, what did it take internally to produce that recognition?
Yeah, we had to slog through a lot of, when we started this work at CARE, we had sort of a list of 200 interventions that CARE was really confident all had the potential for scale, because there is this tendency to assume that because something's impactful, it's also scalable. And so it was in the process of analyzing them and figuring out how to analyze them, like what tools should we use, that we started to recognize that by and large, these interventions, because they're trying to solve complex problems, they're not simple, affordable, and cost-effective enough for these other actors to scale. But then we had to tell this to the teams.
I'm gonna keep interrupting. So that was that your unit that was charged with doing that and empowered to do that?
We were empowered to do the work. The first step was we had to come up with the tools, which was hard. We were empowered to do that work. I won't say that all the teams welcomed the information we shared. Like, I think that at the outset, what they really thought we were going to do is figure out how to scale things, right? And it was sort of us that said, okay, but first we have to assess whether or not these things can be scaled. And so that shift, so I think we disappointed an institution that thought that, we were going to figure out how to scale things in 2 years or 5 years.
And was leadership sort of driving you on that, or were you sort of bringing leadership along as you came to know more?
I think that leadership was very committed to the idea that we needed to be working towards exponential scale. I think that the hope was that most of the interventions that we had, we would be able to scale to.
So they didn't like the answer to some extent.
They were supportive. It was the teams that didn't like it more, but yeah, it took a while to convince leadership that that we were right.
And was it a single visionary leadership, or what process led to the creation of your function in the first place?
I was not there when it happened. And so, but what I gather is that it was sort of at the executive leadership and board level, just this recognition of everything you guys said. We're not going to achieve the SDGs if we don't focus on scale. And so that recognition had sort of happened at that level. And when the 2020 to 2030 strategic plan was being put together, scale was actually identified as one of 3 core pillars of how we needed to work forward. The other 2 being localization, and because we're CARE, a gender focus, right? And so that created the impetus for, and then they started to think about, okay, so how are we going to figure out this scale question? And they realized over time that probably the teams that were implementing the interventions as they are were not going to be in the right place to be able to also think about how to scale them, and that you might need an external team.
That was a really brilliant move on their part.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think the question that I have for you guys, we can talk about it later, is that, but at what point have you incubated the ideas of scale enough, and then you have to just sort of embed them?
I'm gonna try and get them.
Yeah, like, do you keep an external scaling body forever?
Okay, let's pause right there and tell the story from CRS's point of view.
So CRS, when we look at scale, it really falls into the transformative framing. And how our
From the
story-
get-go or now?
There were other ideas for sure, but if we look back at our story, which we did in the case study, we really look back retrospectively almost 20 years and our journey to come to this point. So it's been quite a journey to come here. And part of that is when we started to look at what is scale, we looked at various cases similar to what CARE did. But when we looked at it, we started to see it wasn't one project or two projects. When we trace the story back, it was often 4 to 5 projects that led towards this scaled outcome in the country. So that's a lot of how we look at scale, and that's how we actually started to form that. There was resistance within this journey, but I would say there was probably less resistance than when I talked to Anita, although she's also just very open and honest about things. So that's also helpful. Because I think a lot of it was the leadership had created, after seeing this 20-year journey of coming to this point, the vision, the 2030 vision really emerged from that. And so the vision wasn't emerging necessarily from leadership saying we need to move in this direction, although that was part of the case. It was also emerging from country programs saying this is a direction we need to go.
But yours, like Anita's, somehow took shape around this 2030 vision.
It did, very similar. So
Yeah.
in 2030, we'd actually put a lot of resourcing around applying for a large grant. There was a competition, 100 and change grant.
Yeah.
And it was really focused on how do you achieve change at scale? And that got our entire agency thinking about this question, which then on the tail end of that came our strategy process. And so people were thinking in this direction, and then it informed how we moved into telling this part of our story.
It's a little bit of an aside, but I was involved with MacArthur in setting up that 100 and change process, and with coaching the finalists in the two rounds that have happened. It was really interesting in case after case how the prospect of doing something larger really reshaped the way people thought about it. Sometimes just transactionally, but often just the way you guys did. I really kind of flipped a switch.
Yeah.
In terms of thinking differently.
Yeah.
About things. Do you know, or did you have a close enough perspective to know who or what was driving that process internally? Was it just kind of a ambient recognition of this, or was there a unit then, or was there a leader who happened to take hold of this? Do you know?
I think it was all the above. There was leadership that had really embraced this idea of scale. But then also the challenge of the recognition that the problem, when we looked at the evidence, the problem was so large, so we needed to change how we were working. We could make impact at a certain level through our direct delivery processes, but we realized when we looked at the SDGs and the evidence of the direction things were headed, we were not getting there. So then that really was also kind of a call to we need to work differently.
I'll interrupt you with a kind of an editorial comment, which is that the CRS case I know pretty well because I was involved myself in that early on. And I was really impressed by the willingness of your board to really take a step back and look at this differently. And I think I can't prove this, but I think it's this dual role as funder and implementer that really helped make that happen, because people are just face to face with the limitations of what they can do with their own resources exclusively and trying to make something happen.
Yeah, and I think when we, a lot of this we did work a lot with my team in the first 3 years on specific mindset shift ideas. And a lot of that, as we're talking about organizational change as our approach, was identifying what is scale for CRS, but then also helping everyone in the agency see themselves as part of that story.
That's right. And did your unit have some responsibility for that?
That was a lot of our first 2 to 3 years. Really, that was what we were focused a lot on, was generating what is our story for scale? How do we work at scale? What does that mean for CRS? How does it fit as part of our values? Which really ties into, we have a strong value of subsidiarity. Yeah. The people closest to the problem should have the power over making that change. And so as our philosophy of scale is developed, it ties into that, but then many staff start to see themselves as part of that story.
And is there an equivalent on that where it was kind of hooked to a values discussion?
You know, I think that I pulled out of your story too, and there was one thing I forgot to say. It seems to me like it's sort of a confluence of leadership support, a recognition that we're not getting to where we're trying to go, and then an analysis of where we have had the most impact in the past, right? And so I think that one of the things that Kira realized in combining those things was that where we had had the most impact is where we had done systems change and where other actors like governments, for instance, had adopted
Yeah.
and spread the interventions.
Yeah, is there a kind of a particular poignant example of that?
I think the Village Savings and Loans Association.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
It's a model that CARE originated 30 years ago, and it's now proliferated everywhere. Governments implemented, CSOs implemented, et cetera. So that's one of our best examples.
Does CRS have something equivalent, something that really would be kind of your poster child of something that's scaled well?
It's hard for me to create a poster child because there's numerous groups doing scale, but I would say in recent stories, so on December 17th, we're doing a work or a presentation with Scale Community Practice specific about CRS.
Yeah.
And one of the areas we're going to highlight there is actually our work with shelter. And that's been more recent where we've seen, you know, the outcomes are direct delivery. We're talking after humanitarian response, we're talking 20 to 30 homes. And now using this different model that we're working with, we're talking more 800,000. It's more convenient, bringing people together to create communities in this model.
Yeah.
But there's many other savings and loans. We also have similar types of processes.
And I'll ask you first, what's the next set of problems or challenges that you think need to be encountered if this is going to go from the level you're at to where it could be?
Yeah. I mean, what we're working at right now really is more let's really institutionalize this more fully. And so it's working in our business processes. So that's a big focus of not only my team, but it's spread out that it's throughout the agency looking at our business process of how do we work at scale. So it's not only one central team, but it's a wider effort. We've worked a lot on how do we do measurement. So how do we do the M&E piece? We've worked a lot on how do we do design? How do we design initiatives to work in this way? And we've worked a lot on how do we do adaptive partnerships, contracting. But really the next big thing that I think we're really working on as we're trying to bring this into every part of our agency is how do we help the diagram that Johannes was showing about the line going up. How do we basically have a model in mind, but how do we integrate this into our business processes of creating that scale level vision at a country program level or regional level, and then layering projects together and using our discretionary funding to help bring that stream forward to 10 to 15 year process. But that really changes our it impacts our entire business model because it's how do we link all these pieces. And so that's really one of the big pieces we're working on at the moment. But it's really like, once we moved into the how, that's where the nitty gritty has gotten quite difficult because it's not only the programming piece, it's the institutionalization of all our business processes are interconnected and we need to pivot.
I'm going to come back to Johannes.
Yeah, I want to, before we move on to Charlotte, quickly bring in a couple of questions from the chat, if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Is
Then
that
I'm going
right?
to come to
So,
Anita on this.
I think they both relate to
Okay.
what you've been saying. One is, how do we balance the time required for genuine localization with a desire for rapid scaling? I mean, I think as funders, we often want to push hard to get things done. But, you know, localization actually takes time. So that's one question. The other one is on the metrics. In your work, have you come across any good metrics that actually show you that you have transformational impact? You know, we're so used to, I think, transactional metrics. You know, so many people this and that. But and GFF is actually a good example. If you want to look at a case that has tried to introduce transformational metrics into their monitoring evaluation, I'd be interested on behalf of Raisin, I think, if you have any thoughts on
Okay,
that.
that fits right in. Why don't you carry on and pick up on that to the extent you can, and then I'll come to you. And
Yeah, as far as like the scale, like I think for us, we're in countries some countries we've been in for 60 years. And we have staff that have worked in those countries, some offices 20 to 30 years. And so when we look at it, there is, the push for more efficiency, quick turnaround and so on, but we really, we continually promote the idea that scale takes time. And how do we create that scale vision, create the milestones that show that we're moving there? And for the one funding opportunity, that's one milestone, but that's not the ultimate milestone that we're moving towards. I think the other important piece along that I really feel I should mention is we're not necessarily looking towards a handover at the end. We're looking at incremental handovers along the way and accompaniment along the way. And that's really what we're trying to, when I talk about changing our business processes in general, we're trying to shift to that collective co-design, co-implementation process towards that entire journey.
That's right. Before I come to you, Anita, I want to ask you, Matt, those changes, the first set of changes was getting everybody on the same page about what we're trying to do. Now we're into kind of the nitty gritty of how do we do this more effectively? How do we measure? How would you compare the resistance now to the resistance initially? Because it's a different kind of thing that's changing now. How does that play out?
I mean, in my opinion, I think because there was so much pre-work with the mindset piece and because it aligns with who CRS is with our values, it feels like now we're in the place where we see the problem and we're trying to figure out how to solve it collectively. I mean, I don't know, like Julie's here who works with me and she's the director. She's not on the side team that's working on this, but she's working as much on many of these problems and thinking through how does this fit with our business processes, as they say, someone on my team.
So see, I think, again, just before I come to you, Anita, I think this is exactly what you're doing is what we hope more fun things that you're trying to do. And I think digging down, as your case studies really try to do, into what was driving this, what resistance it had to get over.
I think that we're trying to document what we've learned so that the institution can learn how to design interventions for scale from the start. And all we've learned is what not to do. We can't actually say, this is how you design for scale from the start. So that's going to have to be a process that we do together across the institution. Another area on the next horizon is leaning into what we're calling a systems orchestration role, where scale and localization fit together. We recognize that care country offices need to play a different role,
That's
right?
what you call it, system orchestration.
We've been calling it systems orchestration, exactly. And I'll talk about the challenges with that, but so we're trying to understand better this role that country offices need to play and experimenting with specific country offices to take on that role related to specific interventions. And then I would say that, of course, behind that, there are all the shifts that are required in processes, policies, staffing, et cetera. And we know that that's coming. I think that we're still in the technical. We haven't delved into the operational, although we're starting to think about it a little bit. And then on M&E, we've been working on it. I'm not sure that we're 100% there either in figuring out the indicator or the metrics and the measures that are going to create the incentives for the organization to move in this direction, or to help figure out if we're moving in this direction, right? I think that we're still working on those things.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the problems that you all are struggling with at the edge, the margin, are exactly the place we're trying to go as a community of practice. So I really think, we'll all learn from what you do, but I think all working together on this has got real promise. I'm gonna did you want to say something else?
Well, I wanted to say just one thing about the challenges of these changes that we're trying to do. Like, one is that, you know, this shift, especially at the level of the country office, it can feel like an existential
Yeah.
threat, right? Because it means different people, maybe smaller, all of this stuff. There are implications for revenue, which are difficult for an organization. And I think that the truth is that we're an NGO, we rely on donor funds. There are not donors out there currently who are saying, we are going to fund you to be an intermediary and to build these networks of local intermediaries, right? Like that acknowledgement or that funding to play that role hasn't happened. Like at CARE, this experimentation is unrestricted funding and one longtime donor.
Just to say,
We
really want to fight, we really want to fight that fight for you.
Thank you.
We really want to fight that fight for you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna turn to Charlotte because I don't want to lose the time to do that. So Charlotte Coogan is the program manager now for the entire community of practice. And within that, one of the functions that she's played is she's been the point person, the lead person for what we call the recipients' perspectives study, because it occurred to us that there were benefits, but also a downside to looking at this from the funder perspective. We focused first on funders because we thought there was work that needed to be done there, and there were also promising practices that were emerging. But it just felt wrong to us to look at funders and not simultaneously ask the question about how this looked from the other end of the transaction. So we've done a survey, not as ambitious or as rigorous as perhaps one might wish, but definitely, I think, a serious effort on our part to look at what recipients have to say, and I'd like to ask Charlotte to share some of that.
Yeah, so we ended up getting information from 45-ish people and organizations, which is a decent number. A lot of that was through an online focus group. And I think what was really interesting is that they're struggling with a lot of the same stuff as you guys are. And they're also being affected by a lot of this. So basically what I think we found was that as funders are mainstreaming scaling, there's really 3 needs that they need to meet from their recipients. And so one of them is about the need for long-term flexible funding from recipients. And what this does is it allows them to have that iterative, I think Matt, you said layering of these projects and this change, and the flexibility to not just walk away after a couple of tries, but to actually learn and grow, which, you know, we all talk about. I think hearing from these organizations, like the opportunities that they identify through their first try or their second try, and that they don't necessarily get to follow that up with a third try. And so that leads into this other need about curious M&E rather than accountability oriented M&E. So I think a lot of the recipients—
That's a good term, curious.
well, like the recipients themselves were initiating these research projects about what was happening within their organizations and identifying opportunities for growth and development. And if they could take that to their funders as like a light bulb moment and an opportunity for, oh my gosh, this is what we could do better, and not be slapped on the wrist for that, or not have there be repercussions for that, that again allowed for this growth and iteration. And then that leads into the third idea about long-term flexibility, not project-based funding, like Nzingi talked about, like Johannes is talking about. Project-based funding is going to force them just to focus on outputs. That's the only option that you have if you're being told 2 years, here, go. But they also need to be able to invest in their own organizations. Overhead is expensive. If you can't invest in your finance and compliance team, then you're boxed out of a lot of these opportunities. And so if we're thinking about localization, well, you can't localize if you're not supporting robust organizations. So I think that we've all been talking about that, but this is just a different perspective about what the recipients end up needing in this process.
When I'm doing presentations on this, I have a slide that says double, double, half, half. And it was a little kind of not very systematic, but I think serious study I did some years ago about the number of donors, numbers of projects, length of projects, and so on. And what I found was that over about a 15-year period, then the number of donors had doubled. And kind of not so systematically, the number of projects had also about doubled. So that's the double. But the average length of project had cut by 50%, and the average size of project had cut by 50%. Double, half. But the consequence of all that was more and more smaller and smaller projects chasing the same problems.
Yeah.
And if you're the implementer, if you're the recipient organization, the on-the-ground deliverer of this, that's a horrible situation. I mean, you spend all of your time trying to balance these sources and uses of funds on things. And I think somehow or other, we need to help people get out of that box. I think it's a very hard box to get out of because it's collaboration and perhaps even consolidation in some cases. But the direction we're going, where all the incentives are to multiplication of actors on this, does not push in the direction maybe that we need to go on this. I mean, I wonder, Charlotte, if you'd had the time and the resources to ask them more questions, what else should we know from that point of view?
Yeah, I think spending more time asking them for their own solutions is always interesting. And so trying to dig a little bit deeper into what are realistic ways that funders could engage with the recipients that will better support them. So often we end up hearing a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities for corrections, but I did hear some really exciting stories about funders who were willing to problem solve with their recipients and willing to sort of think things through. And Johannes, I think this related to the topic about like having a philosophy around scaling there and knowing that this isn't going to go perfectly the first time and just having that interpersonal skill. But that was just my own perception.
I will say again, just an opinion, but it seems to me if you really put together localization and scaling, then there need to be partners on the ground. I mean, really indigenous rooted partners that themselves have the capacity to support or something going to scale or to scale it themselves. That's the government or something else. It's not teensy tiny NGOs. You know, the teensy tiny NGOs that we're supporting can do some things, but that's not one of them. And trying to figure out how we basically remain supportive of that kind of innovation and engagement that's community-based and still find a group of partners we can work with at the country level that are no less authentic than the ones we're working with, but do have the capacity to go to scale, I think is going to be part of the next level of all of this. Do we have any questions or comments either online or in the room?
Yeah, we have, well, you want me to?
Go ahead, yes, you
open the
can go.
room? So there's just now a question from Maya Elliott about how do we support operation and maintenance once you reach actually operational scale, or just for sustainability more generally, because that seems to be so often the problem that funders fund investments, but they're not funding operation and maintenance, which are so crucial for long-term sustainability. Is that something you've come across, and how do you deal with that?
I mean, I will just say from my interviews, that was thought of as something that really was holding back a lot of these organizations, is that they're not able to invest in their own organizations, like I was saying, that compliance, finance type stuff, but also in their staff. If you have project-based staff, it's really hard to keep folks around if they don't have career stability, if they, are not necessarily getting that investment in themselves. So I don't know how you do it, but I do know it's.
There is in the sample of case studies, we have one organization, the Systematic Observations Financing Facility, that finances weather observation stations in developing countries, and they specifically actually fund also a share of operation maintenance indefinitely in the poorest countries beyond the investment phase. And so it's a new innovative model that specifically actually says we don't just fund investment, we also fund up to a point, we fund and against results, by the way. It's a results-driven approach. So I think it's a model that maybe funders should more generally, especially for global public goods, should think about more explicitly, say in the health or education area than I think we traditionally have.
Well, you said something just now in passing that I think if people would acknowledge that, I'll say what that is in a second, it would be an important step forward all by itself. You called it the investment phase of the project. Well, that already presumes there's going to be something post-investment. There's an operations phase. I don't hear projects calling themselves that. They just call themselves the project.
Right.
And they deliver for as long as they deliver. And then you come to some cliff at the end of that process. And in some of these things, I think it is right to think of it as an investment phase with the notion that it then needs to have some in perpetuity delivery that's going to happen after that. Rare is the project I've seen that argues that way.
I think at an institutional level, that super resonated with us too, right? And I think that donors are not going to fund a care to change its own structure, right? Like that's one thing. So you have to rely on unrestricted resources, flexible, smaller donors. The thing is that it can be hard to make the decision to make that investment when you're not sure that on the back end, there's going to be funding for you to play the other role, right? So what's the return? And I think that I think that maybe institutions would be willing and able to make the investment in changing their organizations if donors were going to fund them after to play this other role.
That's
But
really
in the absence of both of those things, it's hard.
David?
So first, this has been terrific, and I realize we're coming to the end of the time, so I'm hoping there'll be a way that there can be an opportunity to continue in some way, shape, or form the discussion. And one issue that's on my mind, I've learned so much from your two organizations and Charlotte from your work and from the whole thing that's terrific. The issue is, in many organizations, there are decades of experience where the path to staff advancement was be successful with transactions, such as in the bank, get that project approved by the board for a big sum of money and everyone will cheer. So how do you make that transition away? How do you get to the point where the staff member at an early point in her or his career says, gosh, if I'm going to succeed here, I'm going to have to do this other stuff. I'm going to have to say, that's not just another nice talk by the president of my organization. I got to do that. And if there are success stories, and we don't have time to, probably today go into all of that, but that would be something quite exciting to learn about.
I agree, and I'd like to kind of tune into these two processes, say 5 years from now, on exactly that issue, because I think in both cases, these are not only honest, these are really serious attempts to do this. Both organizations have made deep commitments to trying to do this, and I think still they're going to run into some of those obstacles, and they're just at that point now because they're dealing significantly with the plumbing of the organization, which is going to go straight to Johannes's incentives issue. It's going to go straight there.
We have this in our theory of change, but we haven't tackled it yet. Like this whole question of incentives across the board. It's there, we're aware of it, but it's this whole problem that we haven't quite figured out how to crack that yet.
Hang on one second. I know that. I'm conscious of the time. We're not going to end if the people in the room are willing to stay, but I want to say to the people who are online, if we lose you now, don't let us lose you permanently on this. And the easiest way to stay involved is, if you're not already a member of the community of practice, just join. It doesn't cost anything. Go to the website. Johannes gave you the address, www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. There's a tab, it's easy, register yourself, and then engage on the issues that you care about, including this one. We're really determined to run this one to ground. We have another 1.5 years on this mainstreaming objective. We're serious about trying to help organizations that want to change, do that change. So we don't see ourselves as producing a report and leaving it. We see ourselves now as being in, call it an advocacy mode, trying to help organizations, but also push organizations to move on this. So anything that any of you want to do or can do to help, or if you're in organizations that you think would benefit from help, let us know. It's a mostly volunteer-based thing. For some purposes, we don't have the resources. We ask you to pay for them yourselves. But beyond that, this is genuinely a community of practice. And so the best way I think we can move together is to move together on this. And that means people who care about it kind of mobilizing to do something. So stay with us if you can. We're going to keep going for another few minutes, but if you do need to go, thanks for joining us. Julie.
Yeah, so bear with me. I'm thinking sort of around the funder question. It's very interesting to hear all the funders that the study focused on. It does make me wonder the sort of same questions you're asking of the INGOs, sort of when did the shift happen? Who was playing a role in the shift? I ask myself for the funders and their constituencies or like Congress when it comes to USG, is there a mindset shift there? Is there a sort of embracing, a recognition of these challenges that we're responding to move this scaling question forward? And then even beyond that, are we sufficiently really looking at the fundamental structures of the international financial system and really looking at are there other financial flows that we are not properly harnessing? Are there other sort of macroeconomic mechanisms within the countries that we're working that need to be transformed and interrogated from this perspective of scale? And are we influencing policies from that perspective? If we're talking about debt relief,
Help
these
help
types
us
of
on that. I'll tell you the part that we can answer to, and then I'm going to kind of challenge you to come back and help us on another part. So I think one of the ways we see the community of practice is that it includes funders, it includes funded, it includes research groups, but it does, the COP per se doesn't have a dog in the fight. I mean, we really are maybe a values committed, but otherwise neutral party in this. So we see ourselves as being in a good position to push on things where if an individual organization were pushing, it would feel self-interested. You know, so if it's pushing with Congress, if it's pushing with the World Bank or what, use us. I mean, that's what we want to do in this thing. The how far we'll get is a different question, but I think we're well situated to do this. In terms of these other flows, the one that we've picked out first, beyond the obvious ones, is private foundations. Now, that's not what you were alluding to, but I think it's an important next step because we've really concluded that they can do much more than they're doing, and they're growing substantially, particularly the New Wealth Foundations. So if we could get them on board this, they want to be, a lot of the people who acquired that wealth did so by being disruptors. They want to be disruptors. But if you can get them into the mindset that what they are trying to do is create a new normal on something, not just the innovation, not just the proof of concept, but actually all the way through, I think you can potentially catch them from the beginning or early on with that vision of why they exist and what they're doing. So that's not macroeconomic flows, it's not that, but it is one other significant player in this arena that we have our eye on. Beyond that, I think you're stretching us and in a way we'd like to be stretched. So keep challenging on that. And if there's anything you have any interest in being part of, let us know that too. Singai?
It's a very interesting conversation for me. And probably more important than we realize here. So here's a couple of thoughts or ideas. One is at ADEA, we have both ministers of education and the representatives of development partners meeting together several times. The executive committee meets twice a year. The other ministers meet perhaps every 2 or 3 years. What is interesting there is that ministers are able to say to development partners, this is what we want. This is where it hurts the most. Can you help us in that way? And I've seen a considerable amount of movement from where the representatives of donors of agencies started to where they are today. And I've also seen an interesting development on the part of the recipients or the demand side, where they are able to say, no, we don't want this program. It's not helpful to us. That really is a big mind shift from saying, just give us the money, to saying, no, this one we don't want. We are not interested in this. So that's one idea. Which means really in terms of the society of development, really probably looking at it from the demand side and interrogating the recipients, whether they are government or active participants in development in the country, saying, really, how can we do a better job? Where does it hurt the most? Because I think when the surgeon really understands from the point of view of the patient, then the two can collaborate together in order to cure cancer. But if it's only a one-sided thing, it's questionable. So my last point is really to provoke a question, perhaps to Larry and to Johannes. If you thought about this program in terms of 5 or 10 years, what does success look like to you? What would it mean to have been successful? And if you can have those kind of matrices, what do you need to do from today to get to that success point?
You want to go first?
Go ahead, but I have a.
So
comment also.
that's a challenging point, and luckily we've been talking about that recently, so I have something to say, which is that when Johannes and I started this, I'm going to take that narrowly from the point of view of the community of practice, okay? So when Johannes and I started this 10 years ago, we didn't envision this. I mean, this is way farther than we imagined it would go. And it's going to be more personal than maybe you were asking for, but so it doesn't take much of a look at us to know that we're of a generation, Johannes and myself, and that kind of at some point it's time to hand over on something. So we started talking about, well, where do we want to leave this community of practice and what should it do? Well, one, I think, completely credible thing we could say and do, and I would personally feel fine about this, is we did good work and we accomplished a lot and we moved a lot of stuff. Let's have a big party. We're done. That graphic that Johannes had up about now people are talking about scaling regularly, and there are cases like this. I'm not saying we take credit for it, but just that the field is advanced from where it was 10 years ago. And I think you could, with integrity, declare success and just say, okay, our work is done here. We proposed that to our own executive committee. And they said, no, please don't. So we're trying to figure out a good alternative to that even as we speak. So let's assume that were to come to pass, what would 10 more really good years on this look like? I would say we'd have a lot of organizations recounting cases like the 2 we heard. We'd hear these organizations having worked their way through the plumbing issues and the kind of making this central or even intrinsic to the organization. And we'd have a lot of others following in behind, that kind of thing. We'd have official donors no longer feeling they can stay outside that conversation, but feeling that somehow making change at scale is not just obvious, it's imperative. That we'd have lobbying groups pushing them to do that, not just us, but others pushing them, anyone who cares about the SDGs or whatever comes after that, really pushing and saying you don't get to talk about a project unless you're talking about the problem. And that just becomes the new normal on things. That would be my vision. That does not seem to me unrealistic, even though I understand there are a lot of incentives pushing in the other direction. I can imagine how there are could be a lot of incentives pushing in this direction. Everyone who cares about the problem should be pushing in this direction. So I think our work is well started, and I think it's got a potentially good track ahead of it. But we, like everybody else you're hearing, that's hard money to find. Now, luckily, we run mostly on volunteers, but you can't run completely on volunteers, and particularly when Johannes and I, who are kind of in retirement, stop doing this, somebody's got to be paid to do this. So we, like the organizations that we're talking about, would need to find some resources in order to make a reality out of that. But I want to believe there are people who would want to invest in that.
Yeah, I mean, one metric that I would say 10 years from now, when we have the followers to the SDGs, which inevitably there will be in one form or another, I expect 2030, they should focus, among other things, on the scaling issue. Other fora, for example, Financing for Development 4, next year meeting in Seville in France, a big international UN-driven, forum for how to improve development finance. Well, they should focus on scaling, which they're not so far. The Busan process that we tried 10 years ago or 12 years ago, where we tried to influence from Brookings to get a scaling agenda into the process, we didn't succeed. Well, and if there is a follow-up to the Busan process, these global processes ought to go beyond focusing just on more money, which, by the way, in the climate debate, it's all now about more money. Well, what about actually changing the way we do the climate business? I think, if we could get the scaling agenda into these global fora as a key component, that's to me is the beginning. Then, of course, it has to be driven down into country, governmental programs, it has to be driven into, yes, the funder community and so on. But, we're still even struggling at this high level to get a serious focus on beyond money into how the money is actually delivered at a time when we know, from experience looking back, we know that more money for development assistance or now for climate assistance on its own isn't going to get us there. So we really have to get in these global fora as a minimum. We have to get a more explicit focus on scale.
I'd add one more thing, because maybe a couple of you can help on this thing. We started at a place we think is urgent and accessible, which is the funders. But we start there with the full knowledge that the most important work is the country level. And I don't say that to be sort of politically correct. It's really what I think. It's the only place that this sort of scaling conversation can happen in a meaningful way. This community of practice are not yet active on that task. So if we continue, I'd like to do just like we did with funders, to get a couple of country situations where the possibility of serious scale conversations and kind of self-reflection on this can help not only improve it, but document it. So, if you, CRS, or you care, are sufficiently well situated in a country or in a sector in a country, that it's possible to really stimulate that conversation, we would like to kind of learn along with you in terms of what it takes to really make that work. I can tell you that Brookings, we've done that. That's another hat I wear, is I'm like Johannes, I'm a fellow at Brookings. And I happen to be attached to something called the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. And so in the education sector, we've done several things we call real-time scaling labs. Or we were trying to scale something at the country level, or they were trying to scale, and we were the accompaniment. But that accompaniment allowed us to bring in all of the senior decision makers at the country level for that problem. Now, you couldn't do that multiple times, but it was new enough. They hadn't heard about anything like this before. Brookings has got a little bit of a cachet. So we were able to do this several times. I think doing that a few more times in countries, in sectors additional to education, would add a lot to what it really takes to move this thing forward at the country level. So if anybody's got the heft to do that, I think it would be energy well spent.
Can I ask a question, which is, if scaling isn't getting quite the attention that it deserves, could localization certainly is.
It is.
So could localization be sort of the
We
backdoor to
think so.
scaling?
We think so. And Johannes and I wrote a little piece about the link between the two and the shortcut on that. And see if you agree with this, Johannes. But the way I explain it to people, if I've just got an elevator ride, is I say, look, you could do localization without scaling, but you couldn't do scaling without localization. There is simply no other way. So instead of approaching it as exclusively a localization issue, use scaling as the driver. There's something you want to do at the country level that requires localization. There is no escaping it. And you will find that you're going to get have to work through strong local organizations to do that.
And it gives a lot of direction.
It gives
because organizations are struggling, like, just having local staff, that doesn't count. Like decentralizing, that doesn't count. I think there's a lot of struggle with what does it mean? When you put localization in the frame of scaling, suddenly it's crystal clear what it is that you have to do.
But that's why.
Yeah, that's well said too.
But that's why I actually think, Larry, it's a two-way street. Localization isn't gonna happen if you don't have a scaling mentality and a scaling objective. Because you're always gonna be stuck in the short-term delivery, mode. And so I think the two are back to back.
And I'd say within this really bubbled up within CRS. And so we actually started a convening group that's pretty active, that's scaling, working with systems and our work on localization. And so Julie and I are both in that group, and we meet every 2 weeks. We're looking at business processes. We're continuing to consider what is the bridge between here and how does this play out in the country context, and trying to create that discourse.
That's great. Really good for you. One of the things, Johannes, I'm thinking that I thought it before today, but I think it even more now, is that INGOs, by the way, I know just from different conversations that IRC is having similar conversations with it. So I know of at least 3 big INGOs, 1, 2, and 3, that are really serious about this. And I'm thinking that in those cases might be a kind of a bridge to what we hope will happen in some of the official organizations. I'm not sure, today was an example of trying to do that, but I'm not sure we had the audience that we're trying to move on this. So somehow trying to figure out how to, maybe it's taking the show on the road a little bit, but try how to use this as a kind of a way to kick open the door with people who are not as far along or serious as these organizations.
I don't know enough about Save the Children, but I did work with Save the Children a few years ago, and they were already in those days focused. I suspect they're also focused on it today. You probably know more about it than I do. But one thought this brings to mind is, well, if we could get the heads of 4 large INGOs like yours to, as a group,
that would be good.
to actually, if you wish, confront your partner organizations, say through OECD, DAC, with whom we have a very good relationship, and which I mentioned is now focusing on scaling in a very explicit way, but also perhaps with the multilateral development banks, basically start having a dialogue with them. What is your experience on scaling bilaterals? What is your experience on scaling multilaterals? And what is our experience, the 4 or 5 either
Yeah.
heads of, and it has to be the heads level because you could do it at various levels. But ultimately, I believe to really gather some serious momentum, it would have to be your heads meeting in some proper, useful way in a serious dialogues with the heads of some 1 or more MDBs and the heads of OECD DAC / maybe some senior representatives of
I don't
bilaterals.
think that's beyond our reach. I think we could, assuming there were receptivity, I think we could make that happen.
And just to share that, I think, the next phase that you're looking at, looking at the private foundations, I think could make a nice bridge back to that sort of engagement, going back to the institutional donors and the multilaterals. I say that because for CRS, the only reason we're able to do this is because of private funding.
Yeah.
And I can give 3 examples. One in sort of in the countries where we've actually had one incredible success for scale that Matt didn't mention in Latin America was the Buffett Foundation that said, here's 10 years of funding and I want you to push, it's the disruption that we were asked to do by the foundation. It forced our thinking. That's just one example. Then we have another foundation that supports Matt's entire team for long-term funding. And then we have, CRS's discretionary funding that Matt mentioned, but we also did a special campaign to fund 6 what we call strategic change platforms that are focused on scale of those 6 areas, which
Serious.
invests 10 million plus in each of those areas to provide that bridge in between project funding and invest in the, staff to invest in the relationships, catalyze and
Do
things
you
like
think,
that.
Julie, that I kind of hope that this little sub-study that I'm doing on private funders gets to some of those
Exactly.
issues. I wonder if it wouldn't be worth approaching one or the other of the foundations that are supporting you
Oh, yeah.
on that and ask if they wouldn't be part of this, because I think it gives us a legitimate evidence-based way to say this is a possible thing one can do.
Absolutely. And maybe using those examples, the mechanisms that those private funders have used to harness more of the,
So this is
public
funding they
funding.
provide, in the cases you're talking about, these are private funders providing funding to CRS that allowed CRS to do things in support of long-term change.
Yeah.
Well, I hadn't thought about it that way before, but I think that's, Charlotte, I'm talking to you now. I think this is a really interesting piece to take up in the foundation study. If it's not an abuse, to ask you or somebody at CRS to connect us to one of them. I'd like to have this conversation. It'll be pretty painless for them, but I think they could it would add a really nice piece to what we're gonna argue. We're gonna do something else. Let me try this out on you also, what you think. I was at a college reunion and a classmate of mine spent a career as the historian and archivist for the Rockefeller Brothers and the Rockefeller Foundation. And he reminded me, very smart guy, very nice guy, reminded me of some of the things the Rockefeller Foundation did in years past, going back. So think of some of the big, the CGIAR network, for example, a lot of the public health infrastructure around the world. They were really instrumental. And I said to him, well, just stick with the Rockefeller Foundation. What happened? Where'd that go? And he walked me through what happened to move it all toward project funding and short term. And I said, well, would you be interested and willing to write a piece for the kind of 2-3 pages that just kind of talk about that history, not in a nostalgic way, but a little bit of a back to the future way to say, look, we did this once, and here's what kind of diverted us from that path. Can't we find our way partially back to that? So I'm thinking if we had that, then we had the case studies that we're going to have, and then we have maybe a foundation like the one that you're talking about. It's willing to invest in the INGO, doing the work it needs to do in order to make this change, that would make a really pretty persuasive package. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other
Yeah.
questions or comments?
I have a question, but
Yeah.
it's changing gears a little bit. The question of the external scaling team within the organization. I'd be curious to hear your guys' take on, does that then exist forever? Or, yeah, does it exist
You mean the
forever?
one where Johannes had the bubble outside the organization
Or I
or
just-
inside the organization?
Your
but-
team.
Yeah,
team.
like our teams, right, which are sort of there, you know, like I said, we're at the point where we need to document what we've learned and everything, and our thought is that so we can embed it in all the teams.
Yeah.
But is there still a role for a scaling team if you accomplish that, and if so, what is it?
I don't think we have a case that's been out long enough to be able to say that. But if you ask my opinion is that it should remain.
We have a case, actually, IFAD.
Oh.
IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. If you look at that case study, it's a pretty daunting case study because it's quite long and detailed. But they went actually through a 20-year process of mainstreaming scaling. We actually at Brookings worked with them to get it started.
Yeah.
They then took it over. They had a technical department focused almost exclusively on scaling for about 4 or 5 years, and made a lot of progress, but did not actually penetrate the mid-level management and staff blockage that actually got it down to the center. Then you had a new president coming in. He had a different focus. He focused on decentralization. Scaling was out of the door. They cut the central group and gave it a different focus. Scaling basically disappeared as a main institutional focus, and all the support that had been created largely disappeared. As a result, even less happened at the front lines. They've now started the engine on this because the current president and leadership team is more focused on it. But my sense is if the combination of the leadership losing track of the scaling agenda and then losing this core support mechanism to actually keep the focus then of the implementing teams on this and making sure that you actually track whether the teams actually implement. My sense is you need it for a long time, maybe not indefinitely, not beyond 15, 20 years, but until the point that the organization really has internalized the mainstream of agenda, and you've created the tools and the resources that the frontline teams have, including budget resources, to actually focus and implement a scaling agenda. I think you need that central unit that keeps the flame burning. Otherwise, I'm afraid you're going to be like
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would add just one more detail, which is that our other comrade in arms, Richard Cole, who's in Nairobi right now, is working on behalf of the community of practice in developing what we're calling a mainstreaming tracker. It's kind of like the institutionalization tracker you may have seen that we did before, but specifically on mainstreaming, and it's looking at the extent to which you can find concrete changes organizationally that reflect this having become part of standard practice in the organization. It's going to be one of those ones that gets presented as a spider diagram, and so you'll see we were doing great on this, but not so great on that. I think that will be helpful for organizations like yours. I mean, if the thing were, if you were all the way out to the perimeter and all of the things, maybe you could say we don't need this organization, this driver anymore.
Yep.
If it's falling short in 2 or 3 areas, maybe that means we need to redirect that
That's what
unit to
it
focus
focuses
on those things. I think that might be the way I would look at
Interesting.
longevity.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank people for a really terrific session. This was our first go at this, and we struggled a little with the technology and the hybrid and so on, but I'm speaking for myself, I'm very, very happy with the content. I'm incredibly indebted to the panelists, all 4 of you, 1, 2, 3, 4 on this. And as always, Johannes, I enjoy listening to you. on all this. I think we've got a story to tell on all this. Personally, I think it's, one thing I learned is it's much richer with cases like we had it
Right.
today.
Absolutely.
So if I were doing this again, I would again either ask you guys for repeat performance or find two others, but you may be the best two, because I think actually out of ours, and with the possible exception of EFAD, you've gone the farthest on this. And originally I thought it was potentially a kind of a proof point or something to push the other NGOs, but now I think it's at least as useful for the official donors, because the sum and substance of what you're doing is exactly what we think they need to do. Both the stuff you've done and the stuff you've identified for yourself as to be done. Looks like to me, like it's almost a kind of a storyboard for how to move through this. So I think if we can figure out a way to use it to effect without imposing on you too much, we'll do exactly that.
Thank you, Larry, for wonderful moderation. You are brilliant when it comes to that, so thank you.
Well,
And
thank you,
thanks to-
everybody.
Thanks to SID for hosting us.